thank and want to mention that Rising is presented by Woodworks, Wood Products Council. And we want to also give a special thanks to our sponsors, our level 1 sponsors, Nano Architecture and Huseman Associates Consulting Engineers. Thank you also to our break sponsors, Woodworks and SQW's Ripple. And we wanted to take a moment to congratulate and to kind of welcome the new signatories of the 2030 commitment in Louisiana. We've had a couple of new signatories this year, including 2 since the event started. So I just wanted to, to say kudos to you and kudos to everyone that has been a signatory. That's the whole purpose of this event, to kind of bring awareness to the 2030 commitment and have as many practitioners and offices sign up for the challenge. And what we want to do, if you know somebody at one of these offices, I'm sure that they'll be happy to talk to you about how to sign up. And I know that if you email me or email Kelsey or Z Smith or anyone that has put this event together, they'll be more than happy to help you sign up for the challenge, for the commitment. So when we started to curate this event, we wanted to make sure that we spoke about the challenges and the complexities of resiliency, sustainability, and all the technicalities that it takes to learn about those issues as an architect. But we didn't want to leave out the realities that climate change is affecting everyone unequally. Those people that are essentially living in that have less resources and have been pushed to the most vulnerable areas of the cities, see the impacts of climate change and the threats of that are brought about by climate change much more harshly than people that don't. So we didn't want to move away from that reality and kind of just dive right into what that means. And to kind of set the stage, we want to share a little video that we prepared for everyone. If I can cue it up. Let's see. Can everybody see this video? Excellent. Hold on. Let me make sure that I shared. 1 second. One important thing. Share the sound so you get the full effect. again. So hopefully you guys enjoy that. Let me share again my screen for. And with that, I'm gonna pass it on to Kelsey Wotila she's gonna introduce our panelists for today, which we're so excited about. But before she does that, I wanna also give her and Terry Hogan-Dreyer a special thanks because they've been working on this event so tirelessly, and also all the AIA New Orleans that has supported this endeavor. So Kelsey, take it away.
Thanks, Javi, and thanks AIA New Orleans and everybody attending for supporting this event. We're really pleased with how it's started for the inaugural year, and day 3 should really be a great continuation of it. So to start, we'll have Javier Marcano speaking. Javier is an architect in Esquimalt-Dumez-Ripoll. He has a bachelor's in architecture from the Pratt Institute. He joined Esquimalt-Dumez-Ripoll in 2017, largely because of their dedication to community engagement in the city of New Orleans. Shortly after joining the team, he was named Day of Service Coordinator, a position that allowed him to oversee the firm's pro bono efforts. Javier currently is the Young Architects Forum Director at AIA New Orleans, where he also sits as the chair of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. He believes that sustainability and resilience are not simply labels, but necessities of good design. We also have Jana Ferguson joining us from Pyatt Studio. Partner and architect with Pyatt Studio, Jana enjoys pursuing a thorough understanding of the social, cultural, physical, and environmental context of a project both through research and observation. She believes in a multifaceted approach to sustainability and that design plays an important role in the social, cultural, economic, and environmental longevity. Her professional and academic work spans research, green building design, design activism, and sustainable community planning. David Robinson Morris from the Center of Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit at Xavier University is also here with us. He's the founding director of the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit. Assistant professor in the Division of Education and Counseling, he serves as the university's Director of Corporate and Foundation Relations. David is a social justice and human rights advocate, academic, and higher education fundraiser, liaising with local, regional, and national foundations and corporations to meet the growing institutional and educational needs of Xavier University of the Louisiana community. Liz Williams-Russell is here with us from Foundation for Louisiana. She directs the investments and activities of the climate justice portfolio for Foundation for Louisiana. The program works to build people's power, advance just policies, and cultivate new narratives in support of economic opportunity, environmental justice, and equitable development statewide. As a New Orleans native with deep roots in Louisiana, Liz is no stranger to natural disaster. She interrogates the ways that land use, planning, and development solidify inequities, allowing tremendous variations in investment, social services, real estate valuation, criminalization, and access. And Fallon Samuels Adu is here with us as well. She's a planner, designer, and preservationist. Fallon researches and consults on revitalization, development, and retrofit of historic settlements endangered by disinvestment, development, and/or disasters, main streets to minority enclaves. Currently teaching preservation, planning, urban studies, and design at the University of New Orleans, she previously taught architecture and urbanism at Northeastern University, Harvard, and MIT while researching hazards to historic structures for VREF, AECOM, DMJM, and Fallon, you might have to help me out with that very last pronunciation.
Oxendorf block.
Oxendorf block. So with that, I'll let Javier kick it off for our panel today.
Thank you for that, Kelsey. Presentation here. All right, can everybody see sharing the right one? That's the question that I want to know.
We saw the one with your name on it, the Erosion Deposition.
Excellent. All right. So again, thank you everyone to joining us. As Kelsey mentioned, my name is Javier Marcano, and I'm an architect with SQDMS Ripple. And my interest in sustainability lies in bringing perspective and humility to the world of design. And I'll start where I always like to start. This is, of course, the pale blue dot photograph that Carl Sagan talked about. And I love this photograph because there's perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceit than this distant image of our tiny world. It really puts into perspective our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish this pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. And if we zoom in into that planet, we see the oceans, the continents, weather patterns. This is Buckminster Fuller on top of his dimension map. And he has an excellent quote, which I always love, and I'll read to you. Whether humanity will pass its final exam for such a future is depending on you and me, not on somebody we elect or who elects themselves to represent us. We will have to make each decision both tiny and great with critical self-examination. And the reason why I love the way that he thinks is because he argued that systems thinking help us understand our connectedness and dependence to our local biome. And as we zoom into weather patterns, we quickly stop being planetary and become parts of a system. And I want to talk about first a storm that I know a little bit about, which is Hurricane Sandy. So immediately after I moved to New York City, Hurricane Sandy hit. I was excited to learn about parametric design, fabrication technologies, but I knew there would be time for that in the future. This seemed so urgent at the time. So I changed my classes and studio to focus on coastal resiliency and architecture that could respond to that. For those of you that are familiar with New York City, this is Manhattan, this is Brooklyn, and this is the Rockaways, this is the John F. Kennedy Airport. And when everything was said and done, Hurricane Sandy was a 260-year storm, but studies have described Sandy as anywhere from a 100-year storm to a 1,500-year storm. That means that in any given year, there is a 1 in 100 chance or a 1 in 1,500 chance of a storm causing this level of damage. This is just some images to show what was there originally before human occupation, and then kind of what was after when it was all kind of paved over and levied and controlled. And these are I'll show a couple of maps of what was predicted to be the FEMA 100-year lines, because we were in the studio that I took. We were very fortunate to have access to several engineering and nonprofits doing really technical research about the area, so that we could base our data and our decisions in accurate models. So this is a couple of the models, FEMA 100-year flood, and then other predicted models. And the thing about this storm, Sandy, was what was really made it a devastating storm has some to do with its geographical location, but it had a lot more to do with the people that were in the location where it hit. So, because as it turns out, storms do not discriminate, but humans do. And even though climate change affects us all, it doesn't do so equally. So you can see here, I'll flip back to, so you can see the shape of the rockaways. This is a graph demonstrating the demographics of the area. You can see that it's majority Black, Asian, Hispanic, and other. But then as you zoom in even closer into what the lived experiences of those people are, you can start to paint a picture of the humans that live here, which is incredibly important when you're kind of assessing what the design problem is. So you can see here, female head of household with children, female over 65 and alone, males over 65 and alone, and total population below 125% of the poverty line. So you can see how this community got hit so hard because it was essentially very, had less means, and it was disadvantaged in many ways. And after graduating and working in New York City for a while, I quickly felt disenfranchised by the realities of doing work that was directly or indirectly displacing people from their neighborhoods. This is in New York City. You have to put renderings in the boardwalks when you're covering a project, and this is a kind of somebody graffiti over no thanks. And I was always kind of haunted by this quote by Rem Koolhaas in Delirious, New York. And he's talking about, I'll read it to you, but he's talking about how the island of Manhattan is so tightly packed that anything that happens within the 2,000 blocks of the grid, it's kind of very rigid. So he said, whatever happens, it will have to happen somewhere within the 2,028 blocks of the grid. It follows that one form of human occupancy can only be established at the expense of another. I started to think of a different grid, the dimension map by Buckminster Fuller. I started to think about global, what the grid is when you take it to a different scale. And I really believe that wherever the scale is, no building stands without sacrificing our ecology. And because of this, I think that every building should attempt to breathe life back out. And these are some images from the Salar de Atacama, which is the salt flats in Chile, where lithium and rare metals are mined to sustain our need for battery-powered electronics. So if you have ever held a phone, you've likely have a little archaeological souvenir from Chile. And the reason why this matters is because in our pursuit for net zero buildings and an energy efficient world, we're creating unsustainable environments for disadvantaged communities and countries as we do. So to kind of bring it home, this is an elevation map of New Orleans. I'm sure that a lot of people have seen this map. And as we know, as much as 50% of the city resides below sea level, as much as 11 feet in some areas. But what's important to know is that it didn't used to be like this. Before human occupation, New Orleans was fully above the water. And to understand how human occupation kind of sunk or eroded New Orleans, we must go back, way back to a time before humans. I'm sure you guys have also seen this beautiful maps by Harold Fisk. And the reason why New Orleans is now sunk is precisely because of erosion and deposition, which are the natural cycles by which sediments move through an alluvial plain. So there's a lot of dynamism in the alluvium. And the indigenous people of the land, you can kind of see here the major tribes in Louisiana and how they reside in relationship to the Mississippi and the river basin and the estuaries. The indigenous people of the land were part present of the realities of living in an alluvial plain. Their relationship with the land was symbiotic, rooted in respect for natural elements and their flow. They would migrate to higher grounds and build temporary structures to kind of live within this flow. Needless to say, this is not the same relationship European colonizers had with the land. The colonizers didn't think twice to impose rigidity and predictability through engineering. And here you can see the Cypress Swamp, kind of to the left of the French Quarter, or used to be the historic French Quarter. This was just a mere nuisance to colonial expansion. And the complex dynamism of the Mississippi River and the river basin was in direct conflict with the expectations of reliable and predictable transportation to support an economy based on extraction. So in this image, you can see the multiple levees and canals that were created in order to ease transportation and kind of drain that area of the swamp. And when runoff is removed and artificial levees prevent the river from overtopping, the groundwater lowers and the soil dries out and the organic matter decays. That's why we are now left with, this kind of the human leftover of what we did to the land. This is called we're now in the Anthropocene, how we're shaping and geographies and ecosystems. And so going back to Hurricane Sandy and Rem Koolhaas and Buckminster-Fuller, I started to think about a storm that I knew less about, Hurricane Katrina. This is the map of the flooding that happened in Katrina. And as you lay over the many maps that also give you a picture of who lives in these areas, you start to realize a pattern. So you can see poverty rates. You can compare that to low wages. You can compare it to education attainment, areas of low education. Even housing affordability. This is cost burden renters. And you would think that maybe this is just a coincidence until you see something like this. This was not such coincidence, this was by design. And this is, if you're not familiar with these maps, in 1935, the Home Owners Loan Corporation created maps of hundreds of cities across the U.S. to determine residential security across the U.S. So this is kind of the legacy of what we now call redlining, in which lower income families had been denied access to credit based on their race. And the colors here kind of mean green, best, blue, still desirable, yellow, definitely declining, and D, hazardous. But there's some specific language about the D areas. The type D neighborhoods were largely Black, poor, and working class, and they were determined hazardous for their, and this is a direct quote, their infiltration of inharmonious racial or nationality groups. So this kind of just lets you, it poses a question. How did we let this happen, and what do we do now that we know how climate change, the environment, our ecology, and our place globally are all interconnected, and how we've kind of pushed the most vulnerable communities in our city to the most vulnerable areas within them. And to kind of shift gears to a more positive note, you know, this is a quote from a poem by a social activist that talks about sustainability. What did you do once you knew? You know, kind of before this time, we're all kind of working without knowing, or, you know, we just kind of turn a blind eye. But now that we know, what must we do? And what I would recommend one could do is be an advocate for design access in your community. There's, or this is a photograph of our day of service at Esquidumas Ripple that we host every year, where we kind of donate the time of our office for an entire day to community-based projects, all pro bono. Invest your professional talent in any way you can in those communities that have a history of discriminatory disinvestment, so they can start to turn the dial the other way. This is a map of all the signatories to the 1+, which is an organization that kind of tracks people are kind of signed up to commit 1% of their billable hours yearly to pro bono efforts. So this kind of is scalable with your practice, depending on how many people you have. If you're a single practitioner, that kind of averages out to about 20 hours per year per employee. And lastly, I want to leave you with the definition of sustainability by Buckminster Fuller. And he said, sustainability is to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without the ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. Thank you. All right, so now we'll shift gears to Jenna. If you're there, unmute yourself. Perfect. All right, Jenna, take it away.
Can you all hear me okay? Let me share this.
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. Okay, so as Kelsey said, my name's Jana Ferguson, and I am a partner and architect with Pyatt Studio Architecture and Planning. Our office is located in Boulder, Colorado. I've been with Pyatt Studio for about 8 years, and today I'm gonna share a little bit about our approach to design projects, and then kind of go through some of our projects as it relates to that approach. So this is going to sound a little bit cliche, but I'm going to say it anyway. No one knows as much as everyone. And I think it's, you know, we as architects, we bring a really valuable and unique set of skills to any project. But I would also say that when you're striving for meaningful results, which I would say, you know, most architects probably are, equally valuable is a community member's lived experience in that community, and understanding how the built environment can support that lived experience. Each community has its own unique social and cultural environment, and the only way to be able to incorporate these into a project is by listening. So our projects always start with community engagement, and this can look different depending on, you know, size and scale and complexity of project. But gathering stakeholder input is really always our foundation. And I think this particular step, I think, is a lot of times skipped due to their logistical challenges in terms of scheduling these events, or project schedule constraints, and a number of things. And to put it bluntly, I think that that's unfortunate. Hopefully you'll see why. And we're also inspired by place. You know, each place has its own physical environment. And as Javier was just saying, each physical environment will change differently as the climate kind of continues to warm. And understanding these, or trying to understand them the best we can, based on research and observation, is equally important. You know, great design solutions come out of considering the social, the cultural, and the physical factors unique to any particular place. And we know that it's very, very difficult to understand a place completely when you're a visitor and haven't spent much time there or lived there. But the more people you talk to and the more time you spend in a place, the more information you can gather. So we are converting, as a company, converting a Sprinter van into a mobile office. And this has enabled us to travel more easily to sites and spend more time there because we're able to camp and work out of it. So we, you know, try and take a very thorough approach to site analysis and spend time on the actual site that we're, you know, working on a project on. And actually, most folks don't realize, but one of the projects that we worked on is on Pine Ridge, which is in South Dakota. And South Dakota, or Pine Ridge, is only a 6-hour drive from Boulder. So it's actually faster for us to drive there as opposed to fly. So I'm going to go through a couple of our projects and highlight really community engagement comments that we got during community engagement and kind of how our design team proposed addressing those. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. It's, as I mentioned before, located on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. It's a Native owned and run nonprofit community development corporation. And so we did, oh shoot, okay, there we go. We did community engagement with them, but we did a series of activities. And the first thing that came out of those community engagements, both from Thunder Valley and from community members, was the importance of sustainability. Their mission is to support and empower Lakota youth and families to improve the health, culture, and environment of those communities, and heal and strengthen Lakota cultural identity. And I think an important clarification is that, especially in tribal communities, I think that sustainability is less of an obligation or less of a political view and more of a cultural understanding, because historically they did live in harmony and in relationship with the earth much more than we do now. So this is a common theme across all the projects that I'm going to present, and how important sustainability is to those communities equally. So I think us as the architect and you know, the communities, we equally bring that desire to the table. So this project, the cultural relevance was also really important through the community engagement. And one of the ideas of how to do this was incorporate the traditional geometry of a teepee camp. So this is an aerial view of Thunder Valley as it is right now. And these are single family homes. There's 21 of them. And each one of them is, you know, there's 7 homes kind of oriented around a circle. And this is traditionally how teepee camps were set up, and it was really to put the emphasis on the community space in between. So that was really the driver behind the form that these kind of pocket neighborhoods took. These houses are, as you can see the solar panels on these 7. They're net zero energy ready homes, because again, the sustainability piece was really important. You enter from the east, which is also kind of traditionally how you would enter a teepee camp, and then also you enter the houses from the east as well. And then this configuration allows all of the roofs to face south for kind of maximum solar exposure for the solar panels. And then This is kind of, again, this is common across all, or most tribal communities, I should say, is the problem of overcrowding. And overcrowding is really a result of lack of homes. Specifically on Pine Ridge, there are an estimated 4,000 homes needed just to combat homelessness. And I'm also going to take this opportunity to say that housing shortages and houselessness was not a problem before the reservation systems were established. So these are kind of the systemic inequalities that affect us all unequally, as Javier was saying earlier. According to what this leads to is if you go to Pine Ridge, you don't see public homelessness because culturally, family members will take family members in. So what you have is overcrowding. And you have, between, I think the last number that I saw was between 10 and 17 people living in each home. And that creates a very, very humid indoor environment, which leads to all sorts of issues. Black mold is particularly is one of the worst ones. According to the Tribal Health and Human Services Department, 55% of all the homes on Pine Ridge have an infestation of black mold. And we learned this from research and also listening to communities and their concerns about this. And what we did was we studied different wall assemblies. So these are two kind of detailed examples that we studied about how moisture would move through these walls in that particular environment. So looking at the cold, cold winter in South Dakota and the really, really humid environment of an overcrowded home, if these were to be overcrowded, how can you create a wall system that basically does not allow any condensation within the wall? So you don't end up with the same mold problems that you have across the reservation. And then safety from storms, again, this is kind of a common theme, but it is, Pine Ridge really is in kind of tornado alley. So, safety from those big storms was a priority. These homes were designed for 120 mile an hour sustained winds, which is greater than what code requires. There was an EF1 tornado just this last summer, and the houses did just fine when that came through. Kelsey, I just want to check to see how much time I have left.
Javi, I think can confirm this, but we've got plenty of time for you to go through all your case studies today.
Okay, cool. I have 2 more, so I'd love to share them with you.
Okay, fine, go ahead.
Okay, so this one is located in New Mexico at Taos Pueblo, and Taos Pueblo adopted a comprehensive indigenous community and land use plan in 2014 that had it really kind of laid out the tribe's goals as it relates to land use, education, housing, all these kind of comprehensive view of the tribe's goals. So we really rooted this project in that comprehensive plan. In that plan, they allocated a 50-acre site really adjacent to the Housing Authority building for new housing development. And I'm going to highlight these few things from the community engagement. So Taos Pueblo is unique because they're actually one of the only regions, or one of the only tribes that has actually seen a decrease in housing stock over the last 20 years or so, because some of the houses, they're unable to be repaired or maintained. So they've actually seen, I think the most recent number I have is between 2000 and 2010, but they lost 200 units approximately in that period of time. And I think it's probably increased since then. And what they're seeing as a result of that is lots of tribal members who want to live on the Pueblo are unable to because there's no housing. Or you have to live in overcrowded, conditions, which the town of Taos is pretty close to the Pueblo. They're actually very, very close. So a lot of tribal folks or tribal members live in the town of Taos, even though they would prefer to live on the Pueblo simply because they've been, there's no new housing development. And I will say that the reason for no new housing development is really, again, a kind of a systemic problem. It's not because the tribe doesn't want to or isn't able to, it's because the kind of systems that we've put in place, the bureaucratic systems that we've put in place makes it very, very difficult and time consuming to do so. So this is estimated to start construction next year. And this, as I was mentioning, is kind of the housing authority building. They wanted kind of a diversity of housing opportunities. So down here in the kind of southern portion, you see higher density. So this is multifamily where young tribal members could rent apartments, or elders could live together kind of amongst each other. So this is higher density. And then this is single family, but a little bit higher density than what you typically see kind of across, especially rural America. And then these are I think half-acre lots that could be developed by individual homeowners who want to buy a lot and then develop it. So we kind of tried to fit in different funding mechanisms to make housing opportunities available to a diverse group of people, depending on what their needs or wants were. And they also, the Pueblo tribes historically used adobe construction, and they're very interested in maintaining that. So we proposed, obviously using adobe construction in the new homes in this development. And then the last one I'm going to talk to you about is the Chancayappi Elder Housing, and this one's in Morton, Minnesota. And this one's also expected to start construction next year. And they've got a waiting list for folks who need housing, and quite a few of those are elders. So they're developing a small elder village. This will be 8 homes for elders. And the main thing I think that came up during this community engagement was safety. And safety was kind of twofold. It was they really wanted a community where they could look out for each other, and then also safety from storms. So this is kind of a diagram of the floor plan. We've got the bedrooms over here, and then the public space over here. And when you put, basically there's 2 lines of them. Here, let me go to this image. Yeah, we kind of flipped them. So you have the porch or the public space of the house facing this kind of community space. So you can watch each other's kids, or whatever the case may be. And then I'll just quickly say this, we built in a safe room, a FEMA rated safe room, and this could withstand a EF5 tornado. So here's a map from the NOAA, National Weather Service, of tornadoes recorded between 1950 and 2013. And I think that Morton, Minnesota is really right up here. So kind of pretty close to where these 2 EF5 tornadoes hit. So that was really important to them. So this is kind of a diagram of that safe room. It's tied into the foundation and is designed within the FEMA standards to be able to withstand a direct hit from an EF5 tornado. So that's all I have. I guess I just have a few closing thoughts. I think these projects would have looked very, very different if we hadn't started them from the community engagement and the stakeholder input. That really does drive our process, and the results are usually superior because of that. I think at the core of most architects, they want their work to be meaningful to the place where they are, and we do too. And I truly believe that starts with listening. That's all I have.
Wow, that's really wonderful. Thank you for that, Jenna. So up next, we have Dr. David Robertson Morris to present a little bit about his work in the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit. Take it away, David.
Thanks, Avi. Let me share my screen with you here. I forgot I was going to be with so many creatives. This PowerPoint does nothing and is not as beautiful as the PowerPoints you have shown, but I'll take some time to tell you a bit about the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit at Xavier. I'm its founding director, and as the introduction said, I'm also the Director of Corporate and Foundation Relations at Xavier, and I'm an assistant professor in education. We will go over a number of these things today. We won't go into too much detail about them. But just a bit about me. I am a native of Galveston, Texas. Galveston is a barrier island in the Gulf of Mexico, right off the coast of Texas. So I am familiar with erosion, and I'm familiar with deposition, given that this island, which isn't supposed to be where it is, has been solidified, or we're trying to solidify it in our man-made prowess, right? I'm also a scholar activist. I'm a professional hell raiser for good is how I explain myself sometimes to people. And I am also a researcher. And my research interests are Ubuntu and Buddhism in higher education, non-Western ways of knowing, and human becoming. And we'll get into a bit of that, right? So all of my research centers around two questions, really. And it's, what does it mean to be a human being? And how might a deepened understanding of our shared humanity, of our shared relationship with the animate and the inanimate, the seen and the unseen, call forth a different way of being and a new way of becoming, right? Which is what I think we're all trying to get at as human beings living in an environment, in a climate that is rapidly changing, and not understanding that the only permanence is impermanence, right? So Ubuntu is a South African communalist notion, which is widely translated as I am because you are, or a person is a person through other people. What Ubuntu says is that in order for me to express my humanity, I need you to express your humanity. And that human beings aren't born, but they are made in relationship with other human beings, right? It helps us to recognize that humanity is shared, that it's a quality that we owe to one another, and that we're all in this together. Buddhism, or socially engaged Buddhism in particular, is what I study, and it's oriented toward practice and pertains to the present. Engaged Buddhism helps us to become aware of the pain points, helps us to walk into the pain or the struggle, and to transform that suffering into something meaningful and generative. This is a quick video that just sort of gives you a little overview on my educational philosophy. And please excuse, there's one misspelled word here. Maybe if you catch it, you'll get a prize. But I just got the new recording in from the UK this morning and did not have a chance to trade that out. So bear with me here.
Through revolution begins with love. In education, politics is embedded within school policies and teaching. We are immersed in a capitalist ideology which places hierarchies and individualism above the community. A new educational philosophy combining aspects of Ubuntu and Buddhism has potential to spark an ontological and epistemological revolution. An onto-educational philosophy comprises a community of learners engaging in a communal unfolding of knowledge. It develops the heart and the mind, engendering moral imagination, community responsibility, and promoting love. Love is a force that has the power to radically change the way we live. Onto-education is democratic, achieving consensus through dialogue. Through deep listening, the community of learners engages in a continual experience of compassion. It is humanizing. Learners understand that their humanness is concurrent in the process of becoming and bearing witness to others becoming. A Buddhist and Ubuntu-hued onto-education, like love, in agreement with Kelly Oliver, bears witness to the process of witnessing that gives us the power to be together in the fullness of our humanity. Love is the oxygen to our suffocating ontologies, gasping for breath in a culture of fear. Thich Nhat Hanh said that words get sick and we have to heal them. Rethinking the Western education system through the lenses of Ubuntu and Buddhism opens up a future for humanity free of the epistemic violence of dominance, guided by love and mediated through a pedagogical ethic of love, cultivating the mind of knowledge and mind of love. Such an education is an awareness of the transformative power of radical love. Are you ready for the revolution?
So I'm always ready for revolution. If you know me, you'll know that.
Changing the world.
Let's not do that again. And what I heard in Javi and Janice's presentations were this notion of deep listening, of listening to one another and of listening to the environment and listening to the physical environment, right? And if we listen closely enough, it does speak to us. And central into my own philosophy, which is what that is of education, is this notion of dialoguing for understanding. That if we deeply listen to each other and we speak intentionally with one another, and if we dialogue for understanding, then we don't ever need agreement, right? But what we need to do is walk away with a deeper understanding of who we each are and what needs to be done to move us forward, right? And the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit is really the embodiment of my own philosophy and of the work that we've done at Xavier for a very long time. The vision of the center is for it to be a magnet, an anchor, a beacon of hope, and a catalyst for change, which reflects our calling as the nation's only historically Black and Catholic university. Our mission here is to engage, to support, and to promote innovative thinking in a multiplicity of contexts across disciplines regarding race, class, systemic inequities, and a faith that does justice toward a better understanding of the issues impacting modern societies and those issues that are vexing the human spirit. Our work is organized around 4 pillars, and that's intellectual engagement and innovation, policy research, outreach and activism, leadership capacity building and cultural change, and faith and social justice, or public theology. More pointedly, we seek to impact policy, to change practice, and to inspire purpose within 3 primary areas. One of those areas is PK-16 educational equity. A lot of our work is focused here on New Orleans and in the region, with plans to move that work nationally. Criminal legal system reform. We've moved away from calling it criminal justice because most often for Black and brown people and marginalized people, there is no justice. And so we call it the criminal legal system. And looking at how we can center restorative approaches instead of punitive approaches within that system. And the third area of work is environmental justice and sustainability, right? So how do we do justice to live with this rapidly changing environment, our rapidly changing lived environment? Before I go into the program, and Javi mentioned Katrina, right? And I think it's important to note that Katrina was, and still is, Hurricane Katrina, deeply impacting the region. And it doesn't go without noticing that 80% of the homes that were damaged were owned by Black people, right? And over half of the deaths from Katrina were from Black people who lived in the area where the federal levees failed. And the map Javi put up was spot on. The same with redlining, right? We're seeing the impact of redlining in cancer rates, in asthma rates, in soil toxicity. All of these things have an impact, and they are historic, and they are systemic, and they were done on purpose. And so we have to be purposeful in how we dismantle or transform those things to make them right. Right. So the bulk of our programming is really around raising awareness. There's a belief in the Black community, especially at Xavier, that none but the mind can be free. And once we free the mind, everything else follows. And so all of our programming seeks to enlighten and to get people to think about things differently, right? So you'll see here our Sankofa lecture. The first annual lecture was held with Nicole Hannah-Jones, the award-winning investigative reporter and creator of the 1619 Project for the New York Times Magazine. We've held a lecture with 2 of the exonerated 5, formerly the Central Park 5, and White House correspondent April Ryan. We've held programs during Juneteenth to talk about, especially this summer, with the number of extrajudicial killings and the murdering of Black people at the hands of law enforcement. We came together to talk about what it meant to witness America, what it meant to be raced in this country, and what it meant to embody a righteous rage, and what does that oblige us to do in the world. Most recently, meaning last Friday, we held the 2nd annual Sankofa lecture. So last Friday was the 60-year anniversary of school desegregation in New Orleans. And we hear often about Ruby Bridges, right? There's the wonderful Rockwell painting of, well, it's not so wonderful, of Ruby Bridges. But there were 3 other little girls here in New Orleans who lived in the Lower Ninth Ward, who were integrating to school at the same time, on the same day, across the Industrial Canal. And those 3 little girls are now grown women, right? And they're Gail Etienne, Tessie Prevost, and Leona Tate. And we held a conversation with them on Friday to learn more about their experience, which was quite painful and very teary. But we also invited Dr. Walter Stern, who's a native New Orleanian and a professor at UW-Madison, to come and speak to us about how the education system has been shaped by redlining, and how the city has been shaped by redlining. An extremely informative conversation, and the map that the 1930s map that Javi put up, it was central to Walter's thesis, and how neighborhoods were shaped, and how resources are allocated, and how schools and school systems are built within cities. And we held, over the course of this global pandemic, which is not over yet, we held a series of talks and virtual panels on the various effects of COVID-19. And the first one centered being Black in America and the effects of COVID-19, given that it was impacting at that point, and I'm assuming it continues impacting African American people most adversely, right, with the number of deaths. We've since had panels that talked about the impact of COVID-19 on the Native American population, which we hadn't heard much about, on the Latinx population, and on rural populations, namely poor whites. This thing is totalizing and it's affecting everyone. The same conversation around COVID-19 and environmental justice was held later on. And we talked about the impact of environmental justice as the underlying issue of a lot of these respiratory issues that the data was showing us. Those who had pre-existing respiratory issues were at greater risk, right, for COVID-19 and for death by COVID-19. So we talked about how we got to this point as a country. And as someone said earlier, these things are systemic. They are not by chance at all, right? And as intentionally as the systems were created, we also have to be equally as intentional at dismantling them. And in Walter's talk, he talked about the amount of work that had to go into creating segregation, creating inequity, right? this was no small task to do this damage to communities of color and marginalized people. And so we have to lift that up, and also recognize that it's going to take an equal amount of work, if not more, to right those wrongs. That's my presentation. Thank you all for having me here. I'm looking forward to the conversation for the rest of our afternoon together. Of course, I invite you to visit the center's website to find out more information. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, David. That was, as always, filling us with grace. And I got to show you my little Sankofa reference right here.
Oh, I love it.
So I was going to ask you, for all the attendees, are those events from Xavier open to anyone?
They're open to anyone. We have not set the spring calendar yet, but those events are always open to anyone. And the recordings of those events, because they were all virtual, for the most part, are on our website.
Excellent. So be on the lookout for that. And I suppose you could register for a newsletter and get those invites.
Yeah,
so up next, we have Fallon Samuels Adu to give us a little presentation. So Fallon, please take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Give me a second. Even though I do this every multiple times a week, it's always which window am I sharing? All right. And are you seeing full screen or no? Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay, I'll do it this way. All right, that's better, right?
Yes, we can see it.
Well, yeah, so thank you for having me a part of this conversation. As Javier and Kelsey mentioned, I am a kind of, not a jack of all trades, but a multidisciplinary person and practitioner. And so I'm planner, designer, a professor, and a preservationist. And so I'm gonna speak from the hat of preservationist mostly today, but speak about urban design. A little bit about myself though. As part of this kind of jack of all trades-ish nature of my work, I engage in a lot of different methods, and though I do the kind of traditional work, let's say of a preservation consultant, of surveying historic properties and doing archival research. I do enjoy an archive in a library. A lot of what I do is in conversation with and community with stewards of various, stewards of various ages, values, and certainly knowledge bases. And so here in New Orleans, I've done quite a bit of participatory action research, as it's called academically, in the neighborhood of Pontchartrain Park, and served on a number of different committees and commissions in the city and state. The Facade Renew program, I'm on the state's, Louisiana's National Register Review Committee, and National Register for Historic Places, that is, and I was on the Louisiana Landmark Society board. And so it's through that work that I may have met many of you in architecture. And it's through that work that I largely read what's happening in architecture right now as a practice. I also engage in this work as someone who is, I could say, inherited the spirit of stewardship from members of my family who are both African American, Latin American, and indigenous. And so, I include my child here in this picture only to say, autoethnography, as it's called, is acknowledging one's positionality in the work that one does and how you analyze and engage in that analytical process. And so I, certainly drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak, in terms of reading the landscape through the lens of those who make and maintain it, though, as well. And sometimes that involves going to places that to other people would just be really, really cool to go to. And for me, that's also just kind of a family engagement. And that is how I kind of come to this topic and issue, really, of Black heritage loss. And a lot of that is happening as a result of climate change, coastal erosion and storm surges and sea rise, and perhaps more acutely, the rising rates of flood insurance. But I want to talk a little bit more towards the end of this presentation about the fact that not all of the hazards and the dangers of climate change are being that the first line communities are those on the shore. And there are a lot of communities of color on highland and inland, because that used to be the less valued landscape, that are facing significant challenges in sustaining their properties and sustaining really what those properties afford their families, from just kind of the money to eat to a means by which to retain mutuality amongst a diasporic network of people. And a lot of that has to do with how, as planners and designers, we conceive of where and how managed retreat takes place, what kinds of properties are safe spaces to reclaim, how we audit resilience at the residential and commercial site scale, and the places that we rezone and reinvest in as climate conscious, and the people that we involve in that process. And so I'm not going to speak a lot about the work I've been doing with the African American Heritage Trail in Martha's Vineyard recently, but I'm definitely open to questions about that. Much of that work is still very much in the works right now, and talk more about what's closer to home here in New Orleans, Pontchartrain Park, where, if you don't know, this subdivision of the city experienced quite substantial population and property loss. And if I can kind of drive home one point today, it is that while climate change in its acute and chronic forms threatens cultural heritage, climate action does too. And that can mean a lot of things, from retrofits at the building scale to retreat at the regional scale. And that especially happens when we're depositing some architectural form or innovation conceived as climate conscious, because it often involves demolition and displacement. And if it doesn't, it can invite disinvestment and disrepair. And so Pontchartrain Park, geographically here in the city, it's on the lakefront side of the city, and it is now recognized by the HDLC here locally, the state, and the National Park Service as a historic place, and the first Black subdivision of the city, in the sense that it's the first subdivision of the city that was kind of open to Black ownership in a kind of, in this era of fair housing, pre the Fair Housing Act, but in this era of suburban development and then not having racially restrictive covenants on the deeds of these properties. The area, the neighborhood just adjacent to it, just across the Dwyer Canal, south of it, Gentilly Woods, has almost the exact same housing stock, and but had racially restrictive covenants on those deeds. And so one of the things that, sorry, go back one. One of the things that is interesting about the story of Pontchartrain Park is that it's now a way for much of the city to talk about, like, to pat itself on the back and say, like, look what a great job we did at addressing a threat to such important African-American heritage in this city. And that's largely because it was the site of a number of philanthropic investments, and I'm missing a slide here, so I'm very sorry. And so I'll just have to describe it in that the Pontchartrain Park Community Development Corporation received philanthropic aid from both local foundations, Greater New Orleans Foundation and the Foundation for Louisiana, and the Kresge, Certain Foundations, and a number of others nationally. And that funding came in the form of grants and in the form of loans, what's called program-related investments in philanthropy speak. And so those sources of funding came with terms and conditions. And for the most part, they coalesced around the vision that the Salvation Army developed for climate adaptive housing in New Orleans and other Gulf cities. And that included building innovation, but within a budget, because this was going to be federally funded with community development block grants for disaster recovery. But that this housing stock would meet all of these really kind of, at the time, this is 2009, top of the line green design standards. And within budget, meaning that it would be manufactured in factory and delivered and deposited really into these lots within the neighborhood, and that it would deliver on the promise of supplying housing to people seeking to return to this community that was so important to the city, in the sense of being the home of the city's two African-American mayors, Dutch Morial, Mark Morial, and many other luminaries of the city. So that despite the flooded condition that this community experienced right after Katrina, it was still a place that people sought to return to and rebuild in, and thus housing supply was necessary to deliver on that promise. And what was supplied was done in accordance with the funding structures, both the federal funding and the philanthropic funding. And I think the best way of describing it is that there was an investment in scalable typologies that were reproducible by a CDC that was relatively new in formation, and thus not entirely trusted as an executor of this design vision. And I want to just, as architects, you likely look at these plans and be underwhelmed, but this is this aesthetic that matched the innovation, even though the two kind of come from two very different points of time and points of view, right? This is a single family home with a garage that presumably houses a car. And so while might be introducing LEED certifications in the windows and the energy production of the house itself, the typology of the house and then the urban form of the neighborhood is was not what was being invested in by either the foundations or the federal government. And some of that has to do with the community desires themselves. That they had a neighborhood that consisted of largely single family dwellings. It is single family zoned, and what was lost, right, the trauma, are these storied single family residences that became home places for the lives that they built together in a kind of middle class life that was denied to many, many others. And so despite what many architectural critics consider to be, really lackluster and not innovative design of these homes brought joy. And those that were built and those that were not built, which is another outcome of this, were the lack of housing supplied became a source of tension between the homeowners, both those who were dwelling in them and those who owned them but lived elsewhere, and the funders, because from the perspective of the homeowners, there was some cognitive dissonance around the way in which the funding was flowing, right? In the sense of it funding builder subsidies and buyer subsidies. But mind you, 2008, 9, 2010 is also the financial crisis. And so while subsidies are something, they're not sufficient to address not just market contraction for the financial market more generally, but the particular experience of a Black buyer or prospective buyer seeking financial support from a bank, and the same thing on the part of the CDC, a Black-led community development corporation seeking, construction loans to prime these sites for the depositing of these manufactured houses. And so while the subsidies went to the manufacturer of the homes, which was actually in Ohio, and then some subsidy went to kind of fill the gap in for the buyers, the two never quite could meet because neither the CDC nor the buyers had sufficient capital to kind of really make these deals happen. So the amount of housing actually built really just trickled along. And so that really, I would say, is kind of the final point of this case study, which is that retrofitting suburbia for our climate crisis there's a lot of money in it, but the money isn't necessarily going into the practices that will yield their own desired outcomes. And so the retrofits were funded. And so the housing stock that did survive the storm, those homeowners were able to get funding from these same foundations supporting the CDC to, do things that were kind of energy related. But this was, a lot of that got a lot of press, right? Because this was part of the story of how everyone was able to kind of return and re-inhabit, the homes of this historic community. But the degree to which the capital that was supposed to go into these single family homes could be repurposed for other development projects for which the CDC could get capital, right, and could maneuver through the financial crisis, that just never materialized. And so there were plans that the CDC put together and presented to the Redevelopment Authority, which acquired parcels for the stretch of commercial properties along Gentilly Ridge, Chef Mentor Highway, and they proposed plans At the same time that they were proposing these plans for these sites in the neighborhood, they also proposed a mixed-use development plan that included, commercial and housing and some, green infrastructure and an adaptive reuse plan for the structure that was currently there. And so there's this, I think there is a danger in casting communities as singularly oriented in their understanding of climate threats and what can be done about it. And so they may very well be pursuing simultaneously kind of seemingly contradictory approaches to the climate crisis, right? Returning to a place that was, as Javier showed earlier, 11 feet below sea level, that might be mitigated by housing stock, and then at the same time making plans to resettle in on a ridge above grade, I'm sorry. These things don't seem to match one another. And they certainly don't seem to translate into our kind of architectural consciousness of climate action when they look like traditional suburbia in terms of housing typologies and commercial typologies. But I think that as architects, designers, planners, there is a responsibility to engage more deeply with the cultural systems. I believe Jana was speaking about earlier about, Indigenous people have embracing sustainability, not so much as a kind of an ideology, but rather as a cultural value, as an epistemology, a way of thinking and seeing the space and landscape around them. And that takes some learning and some unlearning. And so as an academic, my apologies, I'm gonna throw out some resources for people that are short reads, so not something that requires too much of your time, but there are really great resources out there that can really support the work of designers and in practice. And I hope that you will seek out these ways of learning about these ecosystems and economies that can contribute to erosion and erasure, even when they result in infill development. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Fallon. That was really fascinating stuff. So with that, next up we have Liz Russell. Liz, you can unmute yourself and share your screen and all that good stuff.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. Take it away.
Great. As soon as Fallon's screen comes down, I will share. Thank you so much, Fallon.
Yes, apologies for that.
No worries. These technologies, right? Okay, great. Okay, so hello everyone, good afternoon. I'm Liz Russell. I'm the Climate Justice Program Director at Foundation for Louisiana. Just, full disclosure, I am trained as an architect. It is an accident that I ended up in philanthropy. But I am from New Orleans and my family is all around South Louisiana. And this work is inherently personal. And so the questions that I've always pursued in architectural ways for me have manifested in work to address systems and institutions that allow for the decisions that determine inequities and how they're exacerbated, design solutions, and how those are responsive or not to changing environmental conditions, and many other questions of scale, time, material, and frankly, policy. Foundation for Louisiana was started in the days immediately following Hurricane Katrina, really meant to be a disaster recovery foundation to get resources on the ground out to communities that were being left out of the traditional philanthropic response, and also our institutional responses to disaster, which I'll come back to. I have had the privilege of being with the foundation for almost 5 years now, managing what was originally the Coastal Resilience Leverage Fund and what has evolved into the climate justice portfolio. And I'm really excited to kind of bounce between my ancient design work and the work that I currently lead and manage as a part of a vast team of allies and partners, and from the Foundation for Louisiana Post. So with that, I want to start with the Mississippi River, because I've been on a journey on the river for most of my life. And for me, architecture is a way with which we can understand priorities, trials, and ethics of different civilizations, ways of thinking, building, technologies, understanding nature. And for me, the river is also a lens through which to view this country, through which to view our continued attempts to control our natural environment. It is a manifestation of political and economic considerations, and how infrastructural decisions are made to accommodate and or embolden and capitalize on those different systems. That work for me, of course, has to tie back to the continual erosion and deposition of the Mississippi River over thousands of years. As most of you likely know, the Mississippi River built most of southern Louisiana. As this was said by Javi earlier, indigenous peoples had no problems navigating amongst this dynamic landscape. The river's purpose is always to get to the shortest, fastest route to the Gulf of Mexico. I remember an old professor of mine who said, water is the flattest thing we know. And so this is a way, these diagrams are a way for us to understand the way that the Mississippi used to fluctuate and move. And as many of you know, the high ground areas of southern Louisiana are all along these former river courses, former and current river courses. And it's only been in the last 100 years that we have, and few hundred years with European colonization, that the U.S. has attempted to control the river and simultaneously allowed for all types of human manipulation that bring us to where we are today.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't think we can see your slides. Maybe it's a different screen. All we see is the first slide at the moment.
Oh, okay. I'm going to try to share
That just
screen
fixed
again.
it, what you
Oh,
just
it did?
did. Yeah.
Okay.
You might just need to
Good
scroll
know.
down more.
I'm trying to go into full screen mode, so we'll see. Can y'all see the second slide on the Mississippi River?
No, try sharing again.
No. Okay. And if not, I might just remove these thumbnails and flick through.
I think you need to reshare. I think we lost connection, so we lost connection to your screen. So if you reshare your screen.
Okay. Thank you guys for catching that technical difficulty, because I definitely couldn't see that.
I can share it in mine if you like.
Can y'all see the Mississippi River slide now?
Yes, the sketches.
Great. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was talking about architectural manifestations of politics and economies here. Went through the dynamic history of the Mississippi River, the way that the Mississippi River used to change course about every 500 years, looking for the shortest, fastest route to the Gulf of Mexico. And as you can see, the red lines, we're seeing areas of erosion at the same time as the darker browns, areas of deposition. This dynamic system was always growing in one place while it was naturally deteriorating in another place. And following European colonization, we started to inhabit this landscape, those slivers of high ground, and build out our communities according to arpents that stretched back from that high ground into the back bay, which provided everything from flood risk reduction in those higher areas to being able to harvest firewood along the beaches to being able to fish and hunt in the back marshes. But for me, I just, the river and the way we have managed it has so much of our culture embedded in those decisions. These drawings are both sections of the river in different places, as well as plan views of the river and its history of dynamism. If you think of a column as something that supports the weight of something else, for me, the river is part of the column that supports all of the muddy and dirty and also beautiful and sort of golden parts of our country. And they're solidified into the layers of management of an ecosystem. Because of the control of the Mississippi River, we have seen a tremendous amount of land loss since the 1930s. We have levied off the river, reducing and cutting off its connection to open water, stopping that gradient of fresh water to salt water, stopping the process of annual building of new land like layers on a cake when the river floods. We also have allowed for pervasive oil and gas operations and pipeline dredging, as well as maritime channelization. That has meant that since 1932, we've lost about 1,900 square miles of land. So this means that sea level rise isn't a future scenario here. This isn't something that's on some distant horizon, as I get to hear about in lots of places around the country. This is something that is ever present and has been happening and is ongoing and will continue to influence our vulnerability and or potentially our capacity to deal with that dynamism and think and inhabit and potentially build differently. With the Coastal Master Plan, Javier, are you sharing now?
Yeah, sorry, I think
Okay.
there was something, we weren't seeing your slide, so I'll
Okay.
share it on your screen.
Thank you. I don't know what is happening.
So let me know which slide you're on.
If you could go to the next slide, back one, please. Yeah, back, there we go. Great, thank you. Thanks for that, Javi. So with the Coastal Master Plan, which came after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, we have a new plan every 5 years that designates where we're going to be able to restore in order to slow the impacts of sea level rise on our communities, our businesses. And we also have an analysis, and one of the most sophisticated analyses in the world, regarding flood risk and the level of increased flood risk we see with increased land loss and sea level rise. With the maps across the bottom, you can see those darker blues, which are significantly deeper waters of over 15 feet of storm surge, all the way up to those lighter blues. You'll notice New Orleans remains this sort of star-shaped island in the middle of that. And I would like to just point out that these maps are specifically indicating storm surge-based flooding. And for everyone who is from New Orleans or was here for Hurricane Katrina, you know, many of us feel like there's an asterisk besides every levee. But this does not account for rainfall-based flooding, which I want to come back to. Next slide, please. These are generational challenges. So we think of the Mississippi River on a 100-year timescale or a 500-year timescale. Navigating that scale of time compared to the scale of human inhabitation is tough. You know, we think it may be 10 years from now, maybe 25 years from now, or 50 years from now. But thinking about 100 years from now or 500 years from now, the scale of the landscape is really a different challenge for us. So this project in particular works to reconnect the river, but how do we actually navigate and perhaps fluctuate between the scales of time through which dynamic change actually occurs? Next slide, please. I want to point out that though we have no way to determine where hurricanes cost more, we do have ways of we're very clear on where they cost more when they come ashore. And so you see some of the costliest storms in history. This does not include the very busy 2020 storm season, but some of the costliest storms in history all hit in relatively similar areas. And so I just want to flag that as we come back to a conversation about valuation and the way we think about resources before, during, after, and ahead of acute and chronic disasters. Next slide, please. We also respond to those storms with reactive policies. We continue to see disasters, and then we see attempts to get ahead of design decisions with new policies where we may have failed before. And so there's this continual cycle of disaster event and policy response that we see throughout the history of this country, forever sort of entwining design and policy decisions. Next slide, please. The Mississippi River, as y'all know, drains everything from the Rockies to Appalachia. Everything comes down through Louisiana, and for me, it's always been a very poetic thing to think of this myriad, incredible and cultured landscape as founded and built through the sort of runoff and dirt and discard of everywhere else. There are expectations with climate change that foresee huge increases in precipitation in the Mississippi River Valley, including especially in the Ohio River Valley, where we expect to see almost a 60% increase in precipitation. And again, all of that water comes down to and sort of through our community. Next slide, please. So with that, I probably don't have to tell most of you, since 2005, Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, Isaac, plus the BP oil spill, and then 2016 heavy rainfall events. Just in that period, every single parish in the state of Louisiana had been under at least one federal flood declaration since 2005. This diagram of Louisiana on the left shows that many of our parishes have been under many more than one federal flood declaration. And I want to highlight, because I'll return to the 6 parishes indicated here: Terrebonne, Lafourche, Jefferson, Plaquemines, St. John the Baptist, and St. Tammany. These 6 parishes account for 8.5% of the total NFIP payout from the federal government. This data is a couple of years old at this point, but this is just really indicative. You can see Louisiana, just as our state, the development decisions we make, the way we build, the way we design, the way we inhabit, means that the state of Louisiana is seeing a huge amount of federal payout. So as we think about our communities and design for the future, it's really important that we also recognize that disaster response dollars and recovery investments are declining proportionally, because we're seeing so many disasters across the country. Next slide, please. I want to highlight the 2 flooding events in 2016 because, as you can see, the rainfall amounts for the 2 days in August of 2016 meant that our flood risk was off the charts. There weren't the colors in the rainfall tracking scheme to actually indicate the level of rainfall we saw, because it hadn't been seen before. And so I just want to pause here, because if this amount of rainfall had fallen over the city of New Orleans, how many pumps will be out of service, and how many ways can we prepare for this type of investment? Type of disaster. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the storm after storm after storm, and I want to point out that people are already moving in response to these disasters. Residents with resources, in many cases, are picking up and moving to areas that they perceive as higher and safer grounds. This causes ripple effects across our communities in areas losing population, and I just want to be very explicit here that it is typically the wealthier and typically whiter residents who are picking up and moving, that these decisions for relocation or voluntary resettlement or voluntary retreat are happening based on decades, generations, and centuries of investment, disinvestment, and underinvestment. And in the areas where we're losing population, we see all sorts of ripple effects across our communities. We see decline in availability to pay for social services, reduced investment in infrastructure to mitigate risk, or inability to invest in new infrastructure to mitigate risk, and obviously declining tax bases and increases in poverty rates. And on the reverse of that, because when people move, they're going somewhere, we also see tremendous strains and stressors in those new areas that are receiving new residents. We're seeing, of course, schools over capacity and traffic swelling, but we're also seeing development expand without any regard for where the water goes. We're seeing parishes that would love to see an increased tax base, welcome in any new residents and give all the keys to the kingdom to any developers without any real acknowledgement of predatory land acquisition that's happening in historically Black communities, or the types of affordability crises that are occurring to their existing residents. Next slide, please. So I want to also just indicate a bit of projecting out, because these maps show specifically the residents that are poised to need to relocate based on the flood maps I showed you earlier, and where they're likely to go. So my mom and my brother have moved to Baton Rouge. My dad has moved to Lafayette. I'm statistically more likely to move to one of those places. And these maps are designed off of that thinking. So you see, of course, areas people are moving to the next parish over when they leave their parish in the maps at the bottom, but they're also moving to other regions, right? They're moving to what are the high ground areas. New Orleans within the levee system, the North Shore, Baton Rouge, Lafayette. But we're also seeing totally different ripple effects where Monroe, Alexandria, Shreveport are growing, Houston, Atlanta, Biloxi are growing. And so what does it mean over time to really acknowledge the extent of ongoing migration and the way that that's going to impact all of our communities? And what happens when it's not just looking at one parish, but you're looking at an entire coast migrating at once, whether that's the coast of Louisiana or the coast of the Gulf South. Next slide, please. I want to also point out that these decisions for population movement, and you see this in the section transversal, where all of these parishes are currently growing, regardless of where they are on the ecosystem, across that ecosystem. You see the diagrams at the bottom that showcase the amount of wetland or the amount of flood risk area inside those special flood hazard zones for the NFIP maps. Next slide, please. And you'll also see what starts to happen when you have increased land loss turning to open water. You see population decline in certain areas, you see population growth tremendously occurring in others, and then you see the need for investment in all sorts of infrastructure in order to maintain any semblance of the communities that already exist there. Next slide, please. With these maps, obviously we're seeing a tremendous amount of wetland area, and really indicative, really indicating the extent and the lack of high ground that we have across southern Louisiana from parish to parish. And so I just want to highlight these wetland areas are most susceptible to that increased sea level rise that we're seeing as the trajectory for climate change sees those different projections. Next slide, please. And I apologize that this one came through fuzzy. Obviously, this is a map that's been shown before, and I'm very glad to see that in a number of my colleagues. You know, there are a tangle of discriminatory practices that have allowed for investment, disinvestment, underinvestment across the board, in addition to redlining and racially restrictive covenants that Fallon mentioned. The placement of infrastructure, federally backed mortgages, maintaining discrimination, whether the placement of infrastructure is, you know, drainage infrastructure or interstate systems, you know, these uneven impacts create a type of layered racist real estate valuation that allows for continued exacerbation of the existing impacts to our communities through institutional responses to disaster and to climate change. This is not a future scenario. This is a scenario where we see these changes occurring and we see them being exacerbated over time. Black residents, Indigenous residents, communities of color, low-income communities are more likely to live and work near toxic facilities like petrochemical companies, which emit pollutants and impact the quality of life. They're more likely to reside in areas where there's more flooding, more likely to receive inadequate infrastructure investment before a disaster to mitigate risk. And then they also experience delayed and insufficient response and recovery investments during and after emergencies. And so any work that we do to support design and policy has to account for both the land's history, as well as the systems of oppression that are built into our layers of policies and practices. We have to have the power to dismantle the harmful influences of those destructive practices at the same time as we have the influence to promote policies that are actually beneficial to our people. Next slide. I want to touch on something that's been said by a number of the speakers today, that the people closest to these challenges need to be the designers and decision makers, not just invited to participate in a meeting, but the holders of all of the design and decision making power, community control of resources, self-determination, and especially investment long before a disaster, going into community after a disaster when people are in their most vulnerable point to try to just want to get back to some semblance of the normal life they had before. It's not acceptable to begin a planning process for design work at that time. It takes long-term investment and investment in local leaders to ensure that the trust and reparations of harm at all levels are long in process before you get to a design and planning state. Next slide, please. I want to highlight a process we were involved in 2017 called the LA Safe Planning Process, where we looked at low, moderate, high flood risk. We worked with the 6 parishes I mentioned before. And across a 9-month planning process, we had more than 70 public meetings. We provided stipends to ensure that residents were actually the facilitators of those public meetings. We provided grants to community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, neighborhood groups, fishing organizations, or on and on across the parishes to ensure that the people most impacted were actually the table holders and not just invited to sort of tick a box at a certain point in the design process. This process has to span across scale. And I want to come back to that generational challenge I mentioned before, 10 years from now, 25 years from now, 50 years from now. 10 years from now, maybe you're thinking about yourself, but we tried to back into some of the most challenging conversations. Maybe you're thinking about your kids 10 years from now, 25 years from now. Maybe you're thinking about yourself, but most likely you're thinking about your kids or your grandkids or the generations that follow. And 50 years from now, at which most of the planning for coastal restoration and sea level rise is done at that time scale, most people aren't thinking about themselves. And for us to talk about the realities of ongoing retreat and relocation was necessary to really get people to think about a long-term scale, 50 years ago, 50 years forward. What does it mean from a design challenge to really center community and culture, economy and jobs, environment and sustainability for yourself, but also for all of the generations that follow. Next slide, please. What we ended up with here is a sort of crowdsourced land use map. Before we started this process, we were told you can't go into these communities and talk about the fact that they won't be here. But we didn't do that by ourselves. We did that in partnership with residents and neighbors from each of these places, and we made sure that their leadership and thought partnership was recognized, acknowledged, and valued, and made sure that they were the facilitators of the conversation, so that they were programming out a future for Louisiana that was based on an understanding of different levels of flood risk and land loss and land change, that they were the designers and decision makers. Next slide. I also want to highlight that some of the planning activities that came from this really recognized the need to support inclusive and affordable growth along the high ground corridors across Louisiana, and to begin ensuring the expansion of any existing regulation, or also the support for new policies to make sure that we weren't continuing to exacerbate the level of flood risk we already see across the state. So how do we grow strategically in high ground areas? How do we acknowledge the changes in use an ability to inhabit the land as it inevitably deteriorates around us. Next slide, please. If you'd like to learn any more about this process, you can go to lasafe.la.gov. I just want to say that, you know, the state went on to invest more than $41 million in projects that were actually voted on and selected by community in these 6 parishes. And so these 10 projects you see here emerged from that crowdsourced land use map I showed you. And of course, you see things like buyouts and stormwater management and green infrastructure, but you also see things like an emerging industry business incubator for coastal restoration, water management jobs, or wind energy manufacturing, affordable housing in low flood risk areas, expansion of mental health care services, a safe harbor for fishermen. Next slide, please. But then you also see these strategies across the bottom for different policy recommendations. I want to return to this notion of inhabiting a dynamic system and the way we think about policy design and decision making, and how that is always focused on a sort of moment in time. Meanwhile, everything about that site, that community is changing around us. And so I want to challenge us to think about the different types of dynamism and the different ways that we can think about decisions that actually fluctuate and are designed to accommodate a changing system. Next slide, please. At the Foundation for Louisiana, we're working to invest in building people power, advancing just climate policies, and cultivating new narratives. We invest in all of this work according to a few different priority areas, including equitable development, environmental justice, and economic opportunity. We want to ensure that residents across Louisiana are the determiners of their future and have the resources, time, space to really make the decisions that are on the horizon, and do everything we can to create a more healthy, just, and vibrant Louisiana. Next slide, please. I'm returning to the ARPANS and the way that we have inhabited the Mississippi River, the stories that we tell ourselves that allow us to think about the changes that occur around us, whether they're beneficial or harmful to whom. And I just want to challenge us to think about that history in the way that we continue to build and develop going forward. Next slide, please. The Mississippi River is inevitably tied to the past, present, and future of the city of New Orleans. And we have the capacity to reconnect to that dynamic system and perhaps ensure that we're more resilient to the environmental changes that are ongoing and upcoming. And so it is really up to us as a community to ensure that the people most impacted are the designers and decision makers, and that they are centered in all of those processes as we begin to and continue to expand any activities to actually deal with the crises at hand. Next slide, please. I want to just leave with a few of my students' work from I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. This project where one of the students was designing structures to actually deteriorate with a changing landscape on the backside of Grand Isle, expose the rebar, let the salt water compromise it, let it turn into riprap and breakwaters to disrupt that dynamic system and also hold what remaining land there was in place. Next slide. Another student project measured the land as it disappeared around this particular site with columns spaced at intervals that were affiliated with the time of land loss and the duration that it takes for land to erode on the backside of Grand Isle. Grand Isle loses about 3 to 4 feet of land off of the Back Bay in any given year. And so what does it mean to actually measure that through the architectural condition? Next slide, please. What does it mean to be a part of a dynamic system with elements of structure that remain in place? Next slide. Finally, one of my students recognized that the migratory pathways for thousands of species all stopped in Grand Isle on their way back and forth from North and South America. What does it look like to acknowledge that the island won't be there in the future, but there will still need to be a place to pause for all of the species that are moving amongst the earth? Next slide, please. And really attracting those species long after the island was gone, but to think about all the places of time and scale in which this building and this structure would still have value. Next slide, please. I'll leave you just with a challenge as architects to confront the complexity that is ever present around us, both when it comes to the reality of discrimination that is targeted, that is built into every layer of our policies and practices, and also understanding the ways in which control of land and attempt to pause a landscape in time is increasingly impossible in the climate crisis that we are increasingly confronting. And so with that, I'll thank you for your time and look forward to the conversation.
Wow, thank you for that super thorough presentation, Liz. I always appreciate your way of presenting seemingly ominous information in a very beautiful way. So yeah, please, if anyone has any questions, drop them in the Q&A section below. We only have a few minutes if you can stay with us. One housekeeping thing here. This is eligible for 2 HSW credits. So these are the learning objectives that I should have presented at the beginning, but here they are. But yeah, let's see if we have any questions from for the panelists. So this is for David. As an architect, I often see my fellow professionals and my mentors shying away from working for the criminal legal system, not wanting to build prisons or jails, fear of contributing to the prison industrial system. In your research and what you've learned about inequity in the system, what roles could someone with a design background play to make an impact? What can we as professionals do, or as humans?
That's a great question. The criminal legal system is complex, right? And it's deeply entrenched in a number of things. And the prison industrial complex has to be dismantled. I say all that, but that doesn't mean that as an architect, you can't do your part in helping to design a facility, because we will have them, right? They're not going away anytime soon, although they should go away really soon. How can you design a prison, a jail in the most humane way? How can you design it in a way that does not dehumanize the person that has to exist within those walls, right? So I would say don't shy away from that, especially if your orientation is one of justice and equity. I think your voice, your vision is needed in order to create facilities that engender a deepening of our humanity, right? In situations that often, at least in this country, we have an understanding that it doesn't call for that, and the persons who are incarcerated find themselves in situations where they're being treated inhumanely. So you have the ability through your design architecture to rehumanize and to deepen the humanity through architecture.
Wow, that was really powerful. Let's see, Kelsey, do we have any more questions from the audience?
Yeah, it looks like there was one in the chat. This is for all panelists. What are the best frameworks and strategies for community engagement? I'll let any of you jump in and take that.
You wanna take that question?
I'll jump in first. I think scheduling a community engagement session might be one of the most challenging parts of it, because you want to schedule it when people are going to be available, and obviously that's not in the middle of the day. It might not be after work because you might exclude, certain folks in that instance too. So what we've found is to kind of separate out different potentially age groups. For example, you could do, a short 2-hour, 3-hour session with elders. You could do a short 2 or 3-hour session with high school students. You can kind of break it out in lots of different ways depending on kind of the context. Yeah, I think that's probably what I would add the most.
I think Liz made the point.
Go
I think Liz made the point earlier about sustained engagement, and yeah, there's a lot of head nodding. I think this is a kind of the modus operandi that most would say is the most fruitful and effective, honestly. But I'd also add that one of the things I've encountered, and I discussed this with a lot of colleagues who do this work, is that you need to learn the communities that you're engaging with before you start engaging. And I recognize that can be challenging given, a project timeline, but I, see master plan, I'm on review committees and I'm like, nope, there's no way that time span that you're giving for that is sufficient to understand the dynamics between different community-based organizations who have different stakes, but also different power in their local context and in the process that you're trying to create. And so I think it's really the community engagement, I think there's some community learning. I don't know if there's that's not the best way of framing it, but, and there are frameworks out there about cultural humility, cultural competency, and so forth that you can actually kind of download pedagogies for how to do this. So this is not my original thoughts here. But in terms of incorporating this into an actual praxis, absolutely, it means learning almost in a snowball interviewing way. Who are the different stakeholders? Who do you tend not to agree with when it comes to X, Y, and Z, right? Which then tells you who's not in the room, who's not getting the emails, who's not showing up. That is just as important. And so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I just want to echo Fallon's statements about cultural competency, and there are lots of frameworks to learn from in terms of getting to know the communities that you're trying to work with. I want to acknowledge Adrienne Marie Brown and the speed of trust is slow. And so going into a community at a point when, you have to move XYZ drawings during XYZ timeline according to whichever funding source, it is long after, frankly, the community should be engaged. I'll just mention also, there's some logistical hurdles that can be easily surpassed in any meeting with the right, obviously, support. Transportation, childcare, food, making that available, and ensuring that people, what's the food that people like, not to make assumptions, but like, what is a restaurant that's super popular locally that you can get to cater an event? How do you provide childcare in case people can't come straight from work in an evening meeting and not have their kids with them? What are the language barriers, both in terms of actual language and in terms of technical information? Because, when you're talking about flood risk or you're talking about permitting, like those are not super accessible things, but they're totally things that people can wrap their heads around. The other thing is, I would say, how do you acknowledge and support the time of the leaders who begin to stand out in these processes and show up for multiple meetings or start to be a sort of constant in any community planning process? And really, like, acknowledge in whatever way you can, whether financial or at least from a place of honor, their contributions and their thought leadership and the way that they make, because they're probably engaging a lot with you, but they're also behind the scenes, sitting on porches, talking to their neighbors, talking to people who they run into at the shop, you know, just like what happened at that meeting and this decision's being made about our place. So I think just like finding ways to acknowledge and support the leadership of those community partners that emerge and that are doing everything to carry and ensure that what happens in their community is actually beneficial.
Thank you
I
all.
just want to add one more thing if we have just a few more minutes. I also think, especially as designers, whether it's, you know, planning or an architecture project, I think there also has to be a commitment to what happens after the community engagement. Because, you know, as Liz, you said in your presentation, you know, you don't want it to be just a box to check because the funding agency requires it, or something similar. You know, there has to be a commitment to listen and incorporate everything that was said. Because there is a tendency to be like, oh, that's a really difficult thing to incorporate, and then just kind of bail on it. So it takes a real commitment to follow through on the things that were discovered during those sessions.
Thank you for those responses, and yeah, wow, that was just really wonderful. I think we're running out of time for questions, but we do have a brief message from one of our sponsors, and we'll close the session with that. So I will share that. Hold on.
Every architect is from somewhere, a place they call home. Although we work around the country, New Orleans has always been that place. It's a place of tremendous beauty, rich with culture and community. And it's also a place that has endured incredible hardship. As architects, we're always asking ourselves how we can do better for our neighborhood, for our community, and for our city. Beyond designing great buildings, we have a unique skill set that can bridge the gap between architecture and people and help promote social change. 5 years ago, our Martin Luther King Day of Service started as an internal need to structure a loose pro bono effort into something that would better serve our office and better serve our community.
So what we thought was, we have a unique set of skills that we can offer clients in a pro bono capacity that's a bit more than just painting a house. And that's important, right? And it's not that we want to do one over the other, but what are the unique skills that we can bring to the table that we can leverage only as architects or designers?
As a firm, we had always done pro bono work, but it was haphazard and unstructured. In 2014, our annual research fellow organized our efforts into an annual program intended to reach a broader group of community organizations.
Rather than have it be limited to just a few people and a few principals doing little projects, how can we do it so that it becomes a studio-wide initiative?
And with that, I want to thank everyone, all the attendees and all the panelists. Thank you so much. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as we did in preparing it for you. So thank you all, and thank you for your time. See you next week for day 4.
Thank you, Javi.
Thank you so much.
Take care, y'all.
Thanks for having me. Take care, y'all.
Nice meeting everyone.